on this morning, this afternoon, whatever time it is, whatever time zone you are in. I guess technically it's noon Eastern, so we are officially in the afternoon of the Eastern time zone. For those of you who are dialing in from Central or Pacific, good morning. We're glad you're with us. So I have everybody in listen only mode, so that just makes it a little easier on us to manage the background noise. But if you have a question or a comment, feel free to jump in the chat down below. It's at the bottom of your control panel, and jump in there, and I will do my best to monitor that as we conversation, and we'll get rolling from there. So we are recording today's session, and so if you want to see a review or a replay of the session, you can shoot me a note at scott@cslmanagement.com, and I will get you the recording when we get it up and ready for viewing. So we've got a really good crew jumping in today. It's great to see everybody jumping in. So I want to really honor your time. It's a minute after, and we promised to get started on time, so we're going to get rolling here. And so you're going to see my head going a million different directions. I've got 3 monitors working here, and I'm trying to monitor the chat conversation on my left and make sure I've got what he needs to see up on the right. So if you see me going forward, it looks like my head's on a swivel. That is what's happening behind the scenes. So welcome everyone. For those of you I haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is Scott Fussell, and I'm the Director of Education for CSL Management. I'm a Beta Theta Pi from Middle Tennessee State. And I just had a wonderful experience there. And I've had, what's great about the fraternity experience is when we do it right, it's not a 4-year experience, it's a lifelong one. And I've been blessed with an extraordinary fraternity experience. And it's the main reason I continue to do the work that I do today. And for the purposes of today's conversation, I will also be not only your host, but I'll also be managing the conversation in the chat. Now, I mentioned this a couple of minutes ago. We've got everybody in listen-only mode. It just helps us manage the background noise a little bit easier and avoids distractions. So if you have a question along the way, or you need somebody to clarify something that we share, please hop in the chat section. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and we will make sure that we get your questions and concerns and clarifications addressed as we move on. So just one quick clarifier, though. There is a question section on your control panel, and there is a chat section on your control panel. It would help me tremendously if you use the chat feature as opposed to the questions section. That way I know I'm seeing everybody's comments and I'm not missing anyone. So if you could use that chat feature to ask your questions, again, helps us tremendously, and we'll make sure that we get to as many of those as we can throughout the session. So here's a quick roadmap or preview of where we're headed with this conversation. We're going to be diving into some trends, some tactics, and to-dos when it comes to today's fraternity and sorority housing. We're going to be talking about, gosh, what is going on out there? Because we've all been through a lot the last 2 or 3 years. So we're going to be talking kind of level setting things and talking about some of the things that are happening in the field, what we can do right now, and also what we can do going forward. So really excited about today's session because I've got my good friend Woody Radaman alongside me today. I'm not saying that just because he signs my paychecks. He's actually somebody I consider a dear friend. So Woody and I have got about 30 years behind each other in friendship, and he's a chapter brother of mine from Middle Tennessee State, and we are just thrilled to have Woody with us today to deliver today's content. He is, if there's anybody who's been to more fraternity houses or sorority houses in America, it's probably somebody on our team named Jeff Peterson. Other than that, I don't know anybody that's been to more facilities and seen more and done more in fraternity housing than Woody. So we are just absolutely thrilled to have Woody with us today, sharing kind of trends, tactics, and to-dos going forward. So we've all been in a really interesting environment the last couple of years. So kind of level set things and talk about what we can do going forward is critical, and we're excited to have Woody leading us through today's conversation. So Woody, I'm going to turn it over to you in just a second, and you just tell me when you're ready for me to advance to the next slide. If you don't mind, I'm going to jump in from time to time. If there's a question that I see in the chat or one that that you sparked in my head, I'm going to jump in and interrupt you from time to time. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's get into it. Let's start with challenges. Kick us off.
Yeah, well, first, it's great to be with everyone again, and appreciate everybody taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us and allow us to share at least what we're seeing in the market with all of you. I want to preference, as we start running through these slides, a couple of things for the group. One being that some of this content is not going to look new. And as we talk through some of these pieces, and if you've ever participated in some of our webinars or seen us speak previously, we keep bringing things up that we just don't see the needle being moved on, or things that still remain out there that we as an industry still need to be focused on. So just because it may not look to be fresh content, it's because it's in here, it's because we're not moving the needle, or we still see it as a challenge for us that it's out there. The other piece, the first 17 of these slides, and we've got probably an hour and a half of slides that we're going to run through here in about 50 minutes. They're heavy. And as we prepare and as we presented on some of this material the last 60 to 90 days, and as we continue to evaluate and what's going on out in the market, there's just a lot of stuff out there, and it continues to shift more and more in within 30, 60 day tranches, more than 6 months and a year like we've seen in the past. Things are just moving quickly. So I'm not going to try to be a Debbie Downer as we're going through some of this content, but I think it's very important, whether you're a house director, a local house corporation member, someone on the national team, that you have a good understanding of what is going on and have some talking points. So whatever position you're in and whoever the stakeholder that is before you that you're interacting with, that you have some context and can kind of feel where they are in their shoes versus where you are in yours, because it is tough out there. And right now we're all just trying to make sense of everything as we continue to move forward. So the first slide that you're seeing here are challenges. If you read through the bullet points and things, a lot of these challenges, as we look at as an industry globally from a house corporation standpoint, aren't really any new to this list. And there's not really many that we've knocked off this list probably in the last 5 or 6 years. However, the context behind each one of these, I think, continues to shift. When we talk about volunteer fatigue, it's not necessarily just fatigue as it relates to working for the organization or being on the house corporation or dealing with the challenges that's before them with the chapter. It's fatigue in life in general. And you need to understand that as well, because it is carrying over to everyday life and the challenges that are there. So I think that's just an important twist as you look at that and understanding it. And then when we talk about operational complexities, that keeps moving almost like every 60 to 90 days in real life. And so it's not just necessarily that we have buildings that have very complex systems within them that are more difficult to manage than they were 30 or 40 years ago. The complexities that you see out in the real world in the industries that service our houses are finding themselves into our budgets. They're finding and manifesting themselves in just trying to get people to get to the house to get work done, and the complexities of managing all that when you can't get somebody to fix the ice machine as quickly as you used to. So now I have the complexity there if I got to get ice shipped to the house, and what's that going to look like? So all of these, I think it's very important as you look at your situation and what your role is and where you sit, that these challenges that are not unique to our industry, that you're looking at them from a contextual standpoint of where it sits today. So hopefully that's helpful, but the collegiate demographics, all the different scenarios that go into that, it's just not necessarily seismic shifts in it, but there's just nuances within each one of these that you need to look at as it relates to where you are geographically within the food chain, if you will, that is fraternity sorority housing, and what your role would be, how these are out there and what they are. When we talk about cash flow and savings and capital, we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we go through it. Even looking at those scenarios in the past, it's like, where do we find capital and how do we best execute it and things of that nature. We know we should be reserving 10%. You keep saying that in that piece, but it's different now. When you look at if you are leveraged and you have debt on the house, that cost of money is going to start going up quickly. How long before that is a reset as the Fed's trying to cool the market? All those different pieces come into play here. So let's go to the next slide, but these are just some of the challenges and stuff that we'll continue to talk through as we're going through the presentation today. one of the key elements that we always want to keep it in the forefront, we haven't talked about this in a while, but when we were putting this together and tweaked it, we made this presentation a couple of times going through the convention season this summer, and felt like it would be a good kickoff for our house and home, and just making sure we're all on the same page, is that we want to make sure that we understand the value of the assets that we're working through, right? I know that our friends at Pennington and other folks out there are always working to update this data, but I think this is a few years old now, but they're looking at it and saying, hey, our fraternity foundation assets, the cash that we have to deploy, is around 700 million, but the value of our assets as it relates to the housing is around 7 billion. It's a big difference. And so when we talk about focus and energy and what we need to be doing, I think it's just always being mindful of what we're working into the assets, and what not only does it mean to the experience, to the members that are coming through these houses, but these are real important assets that we need to be focused on and we need to be maintaining because they're of tremendous value. Let's go to the next slide, Scott. The next couple of slides, we want to talk about just the global world that we work in. And this slide, it always brings me a little bit of a chuckle, because I think about this is where we were before the pandemic. These were the challenges that we're talking about. We're talking about service animals. We're talking about labor laws that never came to fruition yet, but may come back in the deal. And we were just trying to figure out how to keep up with growth and building houses and how we're going to get money. I think, boy, those were the simpler days, right? How wonderful it was when that's all that we were trying to deal with. Next slide. Now we look at just from a campus standpoint, we think about the last couple of years and all the different nuances and what we're facing even today at Southern Cal. And we talk about groups disaffiliating with the universities because they're not seeing eye to eye. You have the zoning and the impact that our recognition is on zoning, and what that's happened at Michigan and Indiana, and some of those battles that we're not winning. But we had success at Yale and Harvard as it relates to how our ability to affiliate and all that goes with that is the challenges of men versus women, same sex, all those different things that we were able to win. And then you take Miami that we keep up here of Ohio, again, as on the radar, really to our men's groups that are out there, that even universities now are really looking at the importance of house directors and bringing those to the table. And you may have your hands forced in some scenarios, and it may not work to your favor initially. So you need to be prepared for that and being wise to what is going on with the universities and what you're seeing. Next slide, then we talk about the global aspect of things. Again, COVID is still there, as I just had an email before this webinar, as we were trying to get somebody out to a house to do some testing. Very important time testing that we needed to get done. He's supposed to be there tomorrow. He just tested positive for COVID, so now he's coming Monday. So while certainly not as impactful as a global standpoint to our operations, it is still impactful. And we still see where our vendor partners that we're working with are having delays. We're still seeing delays in manufacturing or whatever because of it. May not be impacting us from an operational standpoint in terms of where we have worried about where we have hand sanitizer stations through the house, but it's still out there. Then you take the rising costs of what things are, the price increase, what things are costing us, and then you take the Fed, who is trying very much to bring inflation under control, and what does that mean to the debt that we're servicing? And then behind this whole complex of scenarios, all three of those, it's impacting the global economic environment, whether it's supply chain, whether it's even being able to do and get the production that we need, then what things are when they're showing up on the shelves or when they are and what they're costing. All of these different elements are just impacting almost every aspect of our house operations, personal operations, and everything in between. So it's a lot, but at the same time, there are a lot within our control that we just have to focus on and what we can be and managing them accordingly versus just throwing up our hands and saying, well, I'm just going to sit here and watch things roll. We have to be proactive in a lot of different areas, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Scott, let's go to the next slide. So looking at just the higher ed industry as it is, and certainly there's a lot of nuances and moving parts, but we always like, from a housing standpoint, how does that relate to us and what we're doing and how our operations are? So again, as a reminder, higher education is looking different and will continue to look different, whether it's because it's driven from budgetary challenges that they continue to face versus the demographics of the students that are coming and everyone's evaluation of how valuable is higher ed to my career and where I need to go. And so you need to be thinking of that. I don't think it's in any way, shape, or form necessarily a detriment to where fraternities and sororities are going, because you can see in point number 3, it's still relevant. Supply or demand still outpace supply on most campuses. No question, there are some campuses where it is a challenge, but when we're doing it right and where things are, where we have our intentions and our focus properly and where we have campus support and the culture, it's exploding, and we know that. But there are a lot of pressures to our campus partners and at the university levels, and a lot of time when that pressure and the financial strains and everything else, we become the redheaded stepchild. Again, not much you could do about it. Be aware of it and understand you have to take more control of what's going on in your environment and where you sit, versus hoping that maybe the sorority and fraternity Greek life office might be able to jump in, because they may just not have those resources. So those nuances are important. I think it's also just coming out of convention season. I think it's really important to think about what I call selective evolution, for lack of better words, is that all of our national organizations are struggling, I shouldn't say struggling, they're contemplating moving into the new world in terms of how we operate and what things look like, whether it's substance-free housing on the men's side of the equation, which there's a lot of discussions on that. And what does that look like? And what does that mean to housing overall in these wonderful facilities? So we'd love nothing more to have an alumni event and just have wine and beer. Why is that a big deal? Well, unfortunately, given the history that we've had, carving that out from a liability standpoint becomes difficult. But these are real conversations that we're having and we're trying to figure out, and we need to be aware of that on the housing piece. If you're a House Corps volunteer and may not pay attention so much to the legislation that's going on at your conventions and things of that nature, you may want to look at that, because there's a lot of discussions about housing. There's a lot of discussion about DEI and how that impacts housing. And if we're talking transgender and all these different scenarios, that impacts housing operations. So a lot of times as a House Corporation volunteer like I was in the past, that was what was going on with the global organization sometime, was just a lot of just chatter for you, because you had so much nuance that you're dealing with at the building that you didn't necessarily have time or the resource to pay attention. I would encourage you to pay a little bit of attention, because it's certainly, at least for the conventions that we've visited this year and the conversations, there is a lot still going on about housing and how it's going to support the experience moving forward, and how do we incorporate some of these changes and challenges that we're seeing from an organizational standpoint, from a member standpoint. How does that relate to housing? And it's good. It's a huge advancement that that those conversations about housing are happening at convention and things of that nature, because just like on the housing side where we've got enough on our plate, on the chapter operation member side, certainly have enough on our plate, and sometimes we don't look over here to housing and how that might be impactful. And what we're seeing more and more, which is great, is those are beginning to marry, and at least a conversation about, have we thought about how this impacts housing, or have we thought about how housing is supporting the member? And those conversations are becoming more and more unified, which is great. The last thing is understand, I think we still, as an industry, are in a bear market versus bull, and from an aggressive standpoint. And I would suspect at least the next 3 to 5 years, that point's not going to shift much. As we see about the economy, we'll have another election, national election coming up. We have midterms coming up this winter, which will certainly impact the political environment. You also will continue to see, as we see what this new wave of demographics and the birth rates, if you will, as they hit the next couple of years, all those things are going to probably put us all in a little bit of a conservative stance from an evaluation. That doesn't necessarily mean that we slow down or we take our eye off the ball in terms of what we need to be doing with our facilities long term. It just means maybe our strategy right now is a lot of planning and watching, and not necessarily just putting our head in the sand. Let's go to the next slide, Scott. Global impact, I think these are probably very common thoughts to most of you on this group today, but I think it's very important that you be intentional and specific in looking at how inflation is hitting your operational budget. And we're going to talk about the budget here a little bit more here in a second. Labor, service, time, as I just gave the examples earlier, you need to be very mindful of it's going to continue to take longer to get things. We're still waiting on electric panels across the country that are taking 24 to 52 weeks, some beyond 52 weeks just to get an electric panel that you can normally get within 2 or 3 days in the past. That's just one example. So lead times, service, having the human capital, the people even available to get the work done, all of that, especially on the labor side of the equation, is impacting service and time. Demand and competition, I look at this a little different in the standpoint of, I don't know that, there is certainly still robust demand for what is out there in the market and what we're going for from a competitive standpoint. But at the same time, it's a little bit exasperated in my mind for whatever my expertise is worth that comment as it related to just the delays and the ability to get stuff made, right? So we need our stuff, we want our stuff, and there's still a healthy amount of money in the market to buy it, but it's being certainly exacerbated by the fact that people just can't get things out of factories or get things made in a timely manner. So supply chain, again, that's all of this is not new news to anyone. We continue to see it as we ask other experts in the industry, and we try to do the crystal ball like everybody else. We're trying to see what it's going to look like. Everybody's, again, maybe 12, 18 months we'll start seeing things. I feel like that's just kind of every 12 or 18 months. We hear about every 12 or 18 months. I don't know that anybody can really say other than it's still a mess, and be honest about it. And then I think it's always important, certainly, to keep in mind just the mood of the world, because sometimes certainly fraternities and sororities are not immune to being targeted when we're not happy as a society, as we look to fraternities and sororities sometimes from a privilege standpoint, or the folks that aren't having the struggles that the most common people are, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent. It's a reality. And so I think it's always important, and especially in the current environment, understanding the mood of your members, of the campus, of the chapter, not necessarily just from a security standpoint, but just from an overall well-being. But we also need to always keep in mind too that if there is civil unrest or some scenario playing out on a campus, that you have a plan in place. Scott,
let me ask you a quick question.
Yep.
You mentioned a second ago, you were talking about electrical panels, and you said 24 to 52 weeks to get one of those in some cases. And you also mentioned the ice machine a little bit earlier. So those are two common things that we see and support on a regular basis. What are other key pieces, key functional, operational, either accessories or components or appliances that we're seeing longer than expected turnaround times on that everybody would benefit from being more aware of? What are some of the things that we're seeing that, man, it never takes that long for this? So what are people need to be mindful of?
Yeah, I would say the only other one that really comes to mind right now is fire alarm components. Honeywell bought up a lot of players over the years, and so there's been a lot of consolidation in the fire alarm panel, fire alarm components. For instance, we were needing the university on one of our projects. They wanted a specific type of sounder base that you could normally get within 2 or 3 days. It's taken almost 45. So I think the fire alarm, your security components, things of that nature, we've seen a little bit of a reprieve, if you will, as it relates to like washer and dryers, equipment, like refrigerators and things of that nature. Stoves are taking much longer. So you could walk around your house and probably pick apart the more complex items. Mechanical equipment, HVAC, now your standard equipment, not necessarily if you're needing a new condenser unit and things of that nature, probably not too difficult, but you're gonna wait probably more than a day or two. It could be a week or two. So what does that look like? Versus if you were doing a major project, like any new project, renovation, new build that we're doing, We're ordering electrical equipment early, fire equipment early, and all of our HVAC mechanical equipment early. Like maybe even before we have a permit, we're making that risk and that call. We need to order these today. So that would probably be your biggest components that out there that you'd want to be mindful of.
That's awesome. That's super helpful. Thank you.
Yep. So let's talk. Everyone likes to kind of understand, certainly where we are with our buildings as it relates to construction and design and different elements. So thought we would spend just a few minutes of what we're seeing on that front as well, as we kind of give an overall view of where the industry is headed. This slide is, as many people may have seen before, and we appreciate our insurance partners in the industry that help put this together and working with Pennington and others. And this information tells us what we already know. Our infrastructure is still old, and over 80% of it is very old. And so we need to be making sure of, if 80% of our buildings out here were built before the 80s, over 80% of it, then we have a lot of work to be done. And so I think that's just something to keep in the mindset as we talk about all these wonderful things that we've brought to your attention so far. How do we manage this scenario where we've got this aging infrastructure and where our focus needs to be? And we'll talk about that more here in a second. But let me give you a few things of where we are, just what we're seeing on the market trends and construction. I think probably the biggest thing here, and we kind of, as Scott asked that question earlier, we've already kind of alluded to the fact things are taking much, much longer, right? We would think we could build a brand new house in 12 to 13 months. It's now 18. And we got to keep that in mind. And even 18 might be a struggle. And that's if we've got all of our ducks in a row, we've ordered everything, and things are going to be just fine. When you talk about summer projects, you really need to, as you go into your next round of CapEx planning for next year, you really need to be very strategic in how much you think can get done. You need to challenge your vendor partners. Your GCs are like, oh yeah, we can get all that done. You need to challenge that, and you need to study what lead times are and things of that nature, because they're going to tell you whatever you want to hear to get the project done, and then fall back on, oh, I'm sorry, we can't control the market, we can't control lead times or whatever. So you need to take ownership in that process and make sure that you're not taking on too much. But a couple of things, it's on a brand new construction scenario, it's hard to believe that we're saying that you should be prepared for $500 or more in pure construction costs, when before the pandemic, it was, depending on the campus, it could run from $300 to $400. And we've heard, we've not verified for us personally, but we've heard there have been some projects, especially in the South, that have come in at over $600 a square foot, and that has relegated many groups out there just to pause before they take things on. So construction costs remain volatile, they remain high. I think it's always important to remember to give yourself enough time, have a contingency, especially if you're going through a remodeling process, because something's going to happen, something's going to be found. And I think the overreaching theme here, especially for anybody, is that if you don't have to take on a big project right this second, highly recommend you that you continue to plan, be ready to act and strike when the market looks like it's ready in your area, because we currently have probably 30 plus projects of one capacity or the other going on as a company ourselves across the entire United States, and not a one of them are they enjoyable at the moment. So not because of our clients, but just because of the industry, right? So it's just really, really challenging. So if someone was like, well, should we start today? I'm going to tell you, unless you just absolutely have to, you may want to pause. And those that have to, that, man, we've been planning for this for 3 years and we're now at the pandemic and we just got to go. Great. I mean, we have several clients in that position as well. Let's make sure we're giving ourselves enough time. Let's make sure we're using the information that's before us to leverage making the best decisions we can, and just understand that we're going to have a lot of patience, and we're going to talk about here in a second, going through that process. Let's go to the next slide. Let's just talk a little bit about design. I don't know that we've seen, those of you that have seen this slide before, and we talk about different ratios and scenarios in the design of houses today. we're still seeing where 350 square foot per bed is a good starting point as we start talking about conversations of dining versus chapter. Are we going to have single, doubles, triples, things of that nature? I think the biggest things that is interesting on all of the new projects that we're starting in conversations is those things are pretty commonplace now. And there are modifications. Do we do country club style bathrooms, or are we doing suite style? All those different pieces, normal conversations happening. What is becoming more dynamic though, and should be in our conversations, is really the purpose of the facility and how the students are going to use it, because that is starting to shift quite dramatically, whether it's because of the pandemic, whether it's just how we're now structuring how students are shifting from an educational standpoint because of the pandemic, or that we're finally no longer fighting about the fact that gaming is important. It is. And so let's figure out a way to incorporate a gaming room and things of that nature, especially on the men's side. It's also on the women's side. You can't ignore that, some of those scenarios. So we're seeing more of those conversations evolve. We're also how we're taking mental health and bringing that into the house, and at least creating spaces that will help our members if needed in those scenarios where they need to be away, they need a break, or whatever it may be. And not even just mental health scenario. What are we doing in terms of just the social side, in terms of providing meaningful opportunities to connect? And again, the meal is certainly a great opportunity for that, and the food service and things of that nature, but just how we use those spaces. In the past, on the men's side of the equation, look, we're building industrial houses that can welcome 400 or 500 people at a time for a social event. I'm not being sarcastic. I mean, that's what we were thinking. We're trying to figure out how can we be durable, because we do welcome a lot of campus every week from a social aspect. We see that continuing to be less of a priority. It's still happening, not saying that it's not, but we're seeing that being a less of a priority, and it's a less of a priority for the men that want to live in the house. And they are coming to us with, hey, we want these types of aspects and be able to have a great place to live, and not necessarily just concrete walls and the social house. So finding those conversations and having that. And certainly on the women's side of the equation, and the conversations that we're hearing and seeing, is the ability to interact and to be able to use the facility more and more on a day-to-day basis academically, and more from what I would call casual social aspects, and certainly the mental health piece. So what we see in design and what we're hearing and where a lot of the conversations are going right now is really on the purpose front, and how will this meet in the next 20 to 30 years? And it's been fun, and it's been interesting to hear where these ideas are going and what we'll see. I think regardless, the next 20, 30 years, technology is going to be critical. So always keep that in mind in terms of your infrastructure.
Yeah, let me add two things to what you just shared there, Woody. I want to make sure people heard you say, man, those conversations are important. And when you said that, you were talking about, man, students are actually saying what they need in ways that maybe we haven't heard them share it before. So if you're not having a conversation with the members of your chapter about what they want, let's make sure we're having those conversations. I think for the longest time, we've gotten ourselves in a sometimes in a bad habit of assuming we know what they want, because based on the experience that we had when we were in the chapter. So I think students' needs are changing significantly right now. The things that are important to them is completely different than what was important to us when we were in school. So would encourage you to have those conversations. The other thing that I would encourage you to do on the flip side of that is, one of these has been really interesting. I'm 50, our daughter's a sophomore. A lot of our friends have sons and daughters who are now going to school. So I'm seeing a lot of people posting their photos on social media about, hey, it's move-in day, and here's what's happening. Here's pictures of my son or daughter's residence hall room and all the stuff that's going on. So, and I'm amazed at some of the amenities I'm seeing at the university level, what they're doing in new residence halls. So if you want to get a good view into what we're competing against, in many cases, go back to your alma mater, or go to, or pay attention to what you're seeing on social media, or actually just go to a campus nearby and say, gosh, I just want to see what we're doing for students these days. Because it is really, it's amazing when you see a lot of what's going into these new residence halls and trying to figure, okay, when I'm looking at the chapter house down the street, I'm looking at that residence hall, how am I competing against that? So those are just two things I would really encourage you to consider in terms of what he's mentioning here. If we're going to keep up with the trends and keep up with what's happening on campus, those are conversations and exposure to facilities that we really, really badly need to have. So you're getting ready to get into physical structures before I interrupted you, Woody.
Yeah, well, let me add 2 points to what you provided. One, it's always tricky when you're talking about making changes to your facility or making updates, or if you're building a new house, whatever it may be, getting what's the appropriate level of input from someone that will be there for 4 years, and knowing that things are always going to continue to change and things of that nature. Totally understand and appreciate that. But it is good to do a temperature check from time to time. There are universal things in design that we will always be there. We'll always have to tackle all those different scenarios. But I think the other point, though, that what we really should be talking to them about, not necessarily do you like this light fixture or this type of flooring material or how you might use this room. Those are important to a point. But I think the point that you made about universities, I moved my son into the dorm last year. Now he's in his fraternity house this year, but I moved into the dorm last year. It was still 2 guys and a bed, block walls, nice building, nothing fancy. But I think the difference and where some of that, I mean, there are some really nice amenities. Don't get me wrong, into the building itself. But I think where the universities have focused, and we've talked about this in the past, and this is where we got to continue to up our game as organizations, and local house corporations maybe not think as much of this. I know our national partners on the men and women's side do think about this a little bit more strategically. Don't see it so much on the local house corporation side, but you should if you don't. I know there are that do, but it's that welcoming. It's that experience when they're there, that they make it easy for move-in. You're glad to be there. You're not dealing with, they make it easy to unload your car and go park and know where to go. They have a cart there to help you move stuff in if you need it. There's people to answer questions. You're not so frustrated when you got to leave and go to Lowe's to get something because you forgot it at home, because there's just people that have thought through some of these things to help the experience side of the equation. So I think that's, whether it's the little things of move in, because you guys hear us and we'll talk more a little, remind it's all about the experience here later, but thinking through those intentionally, it was still a dorm room. At the end of the day, it was not moving into the Ritz-Carlton, but loved it, great experience. It was great for us. It was easy, those types of things. And I think that's where we need to spend some more of our intentionality. And then in those conversations with the members is not so much of the physical side of the equation, but the experience side, because those do change from time to time. Again, using gaming as one example that we continue to see. I never thought in my lifetime that I would walk in and see my son and 4 of his buddies watching a TV screen from ESPN of somebody playing a game. Like, don't get it, right? But it's real. So anyway, physical structures. Again, we've just to kind of wrap up what we're talking about and what we've heard. Again, some of these points are not new to us, and especially to many of you on this call. But I think it's, again, taking these points and these realities that we have aging facilities that we're going to have to continue to maintain and are of extreme value are there. Certainly right now, liquidity challenges, when what we talk about all the growth that we have been funding over the previous 10 to 12 years, and now we look to how that's going to work moving forward. We talk about construction just being a mess and the cost of money and all these different things. So I think what's important when you look at your physical structure in the context of it is thinking, you almost have to right now, in my opinion, if it's not 30 to 60 days, if you can't think that short a period of time, certainly within 6 months. We talk about in our assessment process, we give a 5-year CapEx plan, and we debate. There are certainly your finance folks and your accounting folks or your real estate people might like, well, we'd like to see a 30-year reserve study. In the fraternity and sorority world, a 30-year reserve study is great if you have been doing things right for a long time, or you've not been impacted unexpectedly by a boiler going out or a dip in occupancy, or your chapter struggled or whatever. It's not reality in our world. Reality in our world, we may have to shut a chapter down for 3 or 4 years. We may have a poor recruitment season. We may be dealing with all the global impacts and everything else. And those things, when we're talking about one facility and one budget, those impacts are significant and can take time to overcome when we're trying to plan, we're trying to invest in all those different pieces. So I would encourage you, as you take this information, some of it new, some of it a reminder, as you look at it, you got to look in tranches and context as it relates to the next 30, 60 days, 90 days, right? Between now and the end of the year, we have midterm elections. You're still watching the Fed messing around with rates and trying to think about inflation. You just saw yesterday the Dow Jones dropped 800 points, the biggest drop since 2020, I think, because they're still seeing that the economy is hot, right? You think about fraternity sorority, well, what does that really matter to us? We just had a strong recruitment. Things are going great at our house or whatever it may be. Well, it's going to continue to impact cost to your budget, and maybe not as immediate, but when we think about the next 60 to 90 days, I'm paying attention to that as I'm looking the long term. But then also, just as I said, things take longer, right? We would talk about, let's start talking about CapEx in November before we get in the holidays. We'll get our board back together the first quarter. We'll start making some decisions. Probably need to start a little earlier. And you need to realize, instead of where you might approve stuff, like this is the area we're going to go in January and February, now let's go get the bids and hopefully have somebody lined up in May. You probably want to be thinking about, are those long lead items, and maybe we need to be getting those bids and actually signing the agreement in January or February, so it'll be here in June. So just some things to think about on the physical plant and structure. If you are looking or needing to make investments, or if you are in the planning phase, how is what's going on around us today impacting some of those things? So let's talk about where we go from here. As I said, those first slides, it is a lot, and there's a lot of different elements that are out there, and you can certainly walk away from this scenario probably more stressed, hopefully not, but in hearing all this in the context, we're all under a lot of stress, and we need to recognize that and understand it, that's the environment that we're in. But it doesn't mean that we can't continue to move forward and we can't effectively manage it, because I firmly believe we can. And so one of the things, Scott, let's go to the next slide. One of the biggest things that I'm hoping to do today for you guys is really to try to simplify the focus, because there is a lot of noise out there right now that we can't control, that's coming at us from a negatively impact or whatever it may be, and trying to shift through that or trying to quiet it right now, it's a challenge. So in thinking through this, you can put in order these elements outside of the repeat, the first 4, in whatever order that you are at this point. You might be in the planning stage of a major renovation or an operational change or whatever it may be, but you also may be in the current stage of just studying what's going on in the market, and that's fine. And how you organize these 4 components in your current scenario and how you start the repeating cycle, that's up to you. But as you sit and you think about everything that's going around from an operational standpoint outside of your control, you need to be planning, you need to be preparing. You've got to take action in some things. There are some things that you just cannot delay. If that water heater fails, you're going to have hot water. If you have been planning for 2.5, 3 years to renovate or to replace a leaking roof, you're going to have to make that call and just understand you're going to be paying more or whatever it may be. So, but prepare for it, study it, understand the information is out there. There's plenty of resources, whether it's us, whether it's our insurance partners, whether it's just Google. there is plenty of information out there to verify and check, and opportunities to check these things, and not necessarily just take the word of the person that's providing the proposal or what some architect or even us are telling you. Go out there and verify yourself, and get educated so that you can effectively plan, you can prepare, you can take the action, you can study on the front end of that, and you can study on the back end of what that return on that investment was. And then we're going to repeat until we start seeing things settle down a little bit, and we might be able to go more globally as it relates to tackling more than we feel like we can handle in the current environment. The next slide, also.
Yeah. When you talk about simplifying things, this next slide is as simple as it gets.
Yep.
So I love that you've included this, and eager to hear what your messaging is on it.
Yeah, so I think, right now, given everything that that's going on in the world, you're going to win with patience and kindness right now. And many, especially the house directors that are on this call today, have heard me say it before in different presentations. I mean, the house director that is welcoming to vendor partners to the house, and I was just on a job site last week, and the site supervisor's like, yeah, I have cold water for all my inspectors because when I need them to come over, they know they can at least get a cold bottle of water, right? So he's already thinking about in that scenario. I don't know that it's helped him get in the inspections that we need him to get done, but he's certainly trying to think through that. And so I think it's patience and kindness. We have to have patience in our planning. We got to allow as much time as we can. And sometimes you might not have a choice. Patience is going to have to be required because they just can't get it. And a lot of times they're not lying about that. You can see if somebody's building you something or making you something, if it's custom, yeah, you might want to challenge some of that because it's easy to hide behind COVIDs in some regards, or they may be just trying to manage their labor or a different scenario. But regardless, patience is needed. And I realize there's only so much we can take, and the delays and all the frustrations that come with it. But when you can find kindness and finding the balance between hitting them over the head versus trying to welcome them with a plate of cookies or whatever it may be, it's a balance. And I think I know from our standpoint and our team and what we're working through from a mental sanity standpoint, we're just trying to come from a place of kindness because it just makes it easier. And so as simple and as elementary as those 2 points are, I think they are immensely important right now in terms of navigating the business environment. So let's talk about where we can place our energy, or if you're asking us where we'd recommend. Expense management is huge. You'll see on a different slide, and I'm happy to repeat it here and repeat it again on the slide. A lot of times we create budgets and we don't monitor them a lot. We're just kind of going through, and at the end of the year, as we're looking to create the budget for next year or whatever, we'll start looking at different things. But expense management is critical because the cost is going up, and it's going to impact your net operating income at the end of the year and what you're able to reserve or whatever. So make sure that you're looking at everything, that you're reviewing all your costs, and you're doing your best to manage them as best as possible. I think it's also important to always continue to refine your systems for what's going on today. This is probably a little bit more geared toward our men's organizations that may be on the call today, because we're certainly continuing to adapt and bring expenses to our budget line items that we would normally use our own members for or not be a huge priority. So refining your operational systems and what you're outsourcing or what you're able to do internally and otherwise, I think is very important in the context of what's going on in the environment around you, especially when you talk about how long it takes to get things done. And so again, when I say a system, again, your system may be when you do your capital planning for next summer or summer projects. I used that example earlier. You probably want to look at that system, that timeline, that date, and that impact. And maybe we need to, and process might be a better word for that one. Maybe we need to adjust that process and look at it from that standpoint. Preventative maintenance, I don't know of a time that it's probably more critical. And if you're not effective or efficient at it, you need to be, because you're going to have to make stuff last longer. We were on a call yesterday with a new client that we're helping from a planning standpoint on a potential project. They're currently renting their house. They hope to bring their chapter back on in 2 or 3 years. And so obviously in that scenario, we want to try to keep as much cash as we can and not have to invest too much into the facility to keep our tenant happy. But in that particular situation, they have 4 HVAC units that date back to 1995. I said, gentlemen, you know, making those things last for the next 3 or 4 years is going to be a challenge, but it's one we're going to make sure we got the right PM. And obviously you've got probably pretty good PM because they've made them last that long. So preventive maintenance is really, really critical. And I think taking a conservative approach to our budgets, to our finance, to how aggressive we're going to be in terms of maybe kicking off an investment into the facility. I think you just need to be, from a financial perspective, being a conservative stance. And I think you need to evaluate that again in probably 60 to 90 day tranches, but certainly no less than 6 months. And timing the market is always difficult. I understand that, everybody does. And you might be thinking, well, maybe construction costs are going to come down in 2 years. Maybe, I don't know. But just like we learned over the last 2 years, at one point, wood cost was over $1,000 and steel was, I don't know, let's say $500, and then it flipped within 6 months. Now it's back, steel's much more expensive than wood, and so that really impacted all those decisions. So that's my purpose for, or reason for, making sure that you're testing these things more frequently, because the market is that dynamic and shifting that quickly right now. Let's go to the next slide. Again, a couple of reminders from a financial standpoint. We're typically still not charging enough in room and board rates, and we talk about what things are costing, and we want to make sure our members that we have a healthy membership pool coming in, and we want to continue to make this an affordable experience. We are all in support of that, but we also have to understand the reality of these facilities take a lot of money to maintain, and we have to be realistic with ourselves and with our members and what these facilities require. And typically we see, now it can vary, that we really need to be to about 90 to 95% of what the university is charging. And if we have a deficiency in services and what we can offer right now to really charge that amount, then you need to have those conversations very literally and talk about how we can incrementally increase what we're charging to investments in the facility and try to blend those as you get those numbers back up. But we're still seeing that we as an industry are very hesitant, and I can appreciate all the reasons why. I was with our friends from the NIC and a few others at a campus right before the summer, and we got into a very energized discussion about what room and board would be, and we were challenged on this, and I can appreciate it, but I can tell you long term, if you want to have the capital needed to maintain them, we've got to start charging fair market as it relates to our room and board. As a reminder too, when we talk about focusing on what we can control, we still, even to this day, are working with clients who not because they meant to or whatever it may be, but they forgot about a 990. They forgot about keeping their entity in good standing with the state and all of those things that we need to be doing, certainly from a governance standpoint, that they just dropped the ball on. The chapter closed, whatever it may be, and it just wasn't at top of mind. And that becomes a challenge when you start gearing back up. And we can tell you many, many stories still to this day where folks are waiting to get money out of foundations or trying to get a loan or whatever, and they're stuck and they're waiting on the IRS, and they've been waiting on the IRS for 12, 18, sometimes 2 years just to get their attention. Now, obviously, the IRS got a nice funding in the last bill that was passed. So will that manifest to more people and move that engine along a little quicker? Yet to be seen. But one of the things that you certainly need to be focused on and double checking: have we filed our 990s? Are we in compliance with the states? Are we doing and filing what we need to with our organizations and with our universities to stay in compliance? Next slide. So a couple reminders, financing again, and I've already mentioned this, so I'll go quick here because I know we're getting close on our time. Budgets, they exist. Few budgets exist on the men's side of the equation. Sometimes we see it on the women's side as well, but we don't necessarily are still getting into a good habit of a budget, or if we have one, we're not monitoring. And right now, you really need a budget. You really need to monitor it. You really need to look at revenue. You really need to look at expenses and be very vigilant. It's going to be hard, I would say, this year to reserve 10% of revenues. If you can, great. But you need to understand that the costs continue to rise quickly, and you need to be monitoring those budgets very, very quickly. We've talked about some of these other items already, but I think those of you that are leveraged, that have debt out there, if you're not familiar with when those notes mature, you're not familiar with the rate and how the terms work when the Fed's increasing their rates, you should educate yourself and monitor that very, very closely. And then focus on occupancy. Now is the time. Your students, most of our students are back, and you're enjoying and welcoming them back, but certainly by the end of this month, going into October, and before they go into the Thanksgiving holidays, you should be, I don't care which campuses you are on. I know that there are some campuses where you can't, now they don't even allow you to send leases out or member agreements out until the spring in different scenarios. That is fine. But you need to be having conversations, and you need to be reminding your undergraduate members that they need to fill the houses. What can we do to make sure we have a full house next year? And let's talk about occupancy very strategically with them, and have their buy-in and understanding the importance. Next slide, Scott. Just lightning round. Again, these are things that we share with you guys consistently because we want to make sure that they're the top of your mind. We have hit on a lot of these different scenarios already, but if you're a national staff member that works with house corporations and provide them support, this is something that you should really be talking with them on a regular basis to keep those house corporation leaders at top of mind, that they're looking at these different items and are evaluating them regularly. If you're on the other end of the anywhere on the other end of the equation, all the way down to a house director and how you support locally in real time, it's important to understand how these items impact your day-to-day duties and where are there opportunities for you to keep these in mind. Expense control in different scenarios where you can partner back effectively with the house corporation or your national organization, and hopefully seeing where there's some opportunities to improve, or if there's opportunities to get ahead of something before it becomes a problem. So I won't go through all these different pieces. As Scott said, if you want the presentation afterwards, we're happy to send it. I do want to end on one scenario, on a positive one. I've asked, we can't ask this group, especially with the amount of time that we have left, but for the men and the women, what are the elephants in the room? And we'll just pause and we'll ask, and people ask. And certainly for the men, we hear a few different things, but an overreaching one is the impact of substance-free housing, and what's that going to look like, and how global is that going to get? And for the women, a lot of times the excuses about living in the house or the validity of the house, we talk about alcohol, we'll talk about men and guests, and just all the rules that go in with it. We are firm believers in that the scenarios that we talk about, those are more excuses than realities, because as my son is living in his house and I'm asking him about it, and he's loving it, and he's part of an organization that he signed a pledge about alcohol and premarital sex and all these different things that we're just like, wow. I mean, these guys are very much about, we are a religious or a Christian-based fraternity. These are our values. This is how we're going to live them. If you want to be a part of it, we'd love to have you. This is who we are. And that was his home. And these were his guys. And this particular organization doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, I was not in the Christian fraternity. I had a great time. Many of you on this phone probably did as well in different scenarios. I'm not saying that this is the only way to do it, or you need to be thinking of these different tactics. The point is, they know their purpose. They don't falter from it. They don't change from it. They don't shy away from it. And they talk about it. It is clear. It's who they are as an organization. And this group, it's a fairly new. This group was founded in Texas in the 1980s, but their chapter sizes are huge. They're growing, and they make no qualms about it. So I look at this as an example for all of us as a reminder. You think, well, it's all about the experience. What do we hear you say it about all the time and all these different scenarios? Look to the ritual book, all those different pieces. It works. And this is proof. You can look at Beta Upsilon Chi and their wonderful people and things that they're doing. Not that they're perfect. None of us are. But as it relates to that point, they get it and they don't shy away from it, and they are still thriving. The house, he's in a house university. It's great. I mean, it's good. It's like some of the fraternity houses out there, but they're having a wonderful experience. And so some of the nuances that come with it, it doesn't bother them, and they feel it every year. So just a reminder to everyone, it has an impact. It makes a difference. There are a lot of things we can't control. We may not have the money to repair the houses like we want to at the moment and all these different pieces. But if we focus on why we exist as an organization first and foremost, if we embed that and that purpose and everything that we do every day within that house, and we find opportunities to reinforce it, then we might get a little bit more grace, and we certainly will get a lot more support from the chapter when things aren't going the way that we'd hope or want when it relates to the facility, or we may get more support from them in terms of we're going to have to charge a little bit more so that we can advance the facility where we want it to be, because they've bought into the whole system, they've bought into the organization, and they understand it. It's a lifelong term opportunity and not just something for 4 years or just for a reason to come for a party. So just wanted to end on that, because there is a lot that is out there right now that is going on for all of us, and we want to be very mindful of that. And I think it's just a good way to, as a reminder, that we can see today where organizations that are squarely focused on their mission and purpose, they continue to thrive and have strong chapters and well-run facilities. I'll end there, Scott.
Great, thank you. Well, if you guys would give me 90 seconds, we'll wrap this up for you and get you back to your day. But you're probably asking one of two questions right now. It's either now what or what now. And so just want to share with you just a couple of different things to keep in mind as we're moving forward. First off, we need you badly to stay engaged right now, whether you're a house director or a house corporation volunteer or a NHC staff member or a campus professional. We need your engagement right now like we've never needed it before. As we've talked about before, we've got a bunch of young people, a lot of student leaders who've had a disjointed, disconnected experience the last few years. They haven't had a model for what it's like to run an organization. They haven't had a model for what it's like to live in and operate within a chapter house. So we need your engagement, not just from an operational perspective, but from an educational perspective as well. So the other thing that we would love to ask you to do, what can you do right now, is walk around, look around, and ask a lot of questions. So if we are just walking around the facility and we're looking at it with a fresh set of lenses, then we're asking a lot of questions, we're going to start to see things and notice things and be able to address things that we would not be able to otherwise. So I just want to encourage you, as you're going and you're maintaining or maybe even increasing your engagement, when you're there, please consider not just sitting down with the students and having a great conversation, or as you're having it, do it as you're walking around and ask them to show you around the facility. So you can take a critical eye or critical look at the various, the warts and some of the great things that are happening on the inside and outside of the facility as well. So again, so would encourage you to walk around and look around and ask a lot of questions. Look, we threw a lot at you today. If you have questions, we want you to stay in touch. You can reach Woody at woody@cslmanagement.com. His phone number is also on the screen. More than happy to answer any of the questions you have based on the content he delivered today. If you have any questions for me, or there's anything I can do to come alongside you and your organization, or maybe your house corporation, your house director, my contact information is on the screen as well. So Scott@cslmanagement.com is probably the easiest way to get in touch with me, or feel free to give a call or send a text. The last thing we'll share with you is to save the date. We'll be back with another episode of House and Home in October 12th specifically. And we're going to be talking about pride of place and what prioritizing preventative maintenance actually communicates to your constituents. So we're thrilled to be partnering on that session with our good friend Eric Rowland from Luminat Architects, and it's going to be a really great session and really talking about the nuances and the importance of prioritizing preventative maintenance. So with all that being said, I'll say thank you guys for joining us again today. We look forward to seeing you in October. Appreciate all you're doing, and we'll see you soon. Take care, everyone.
So Scott,